Everyone knows the story. The Soviet Union collapsed because communism simply didn't work. Ronald Reagan outspent it, the Berlin Wall fell, and a bankrupt empire built on lies finally ran out of road. That's the version in the textbooks. It's clean, it's satisfying, and it's mostly wrong. Because if you follow the money, the actual rubles, the actual barrels of oil, the actual loans signed in foreign banks, the real story looks completely different. The Soviet Union didn't die from an idea. It died from a balance sheet. Let me show you something strange. In the year 1973, the Soviet economy was in the best financial shape of its entire history. Not because Moscow had fixed socialism, but because of something happening thousands of miles away, in the deserts of the Middle East. That October, war broke out between Israel and its Arab neighbors. Arab oil producers cut supply, and the price of oil exploded, nearly quadrupling in a matter of months. The Soviet Union was one of the largest oil producers on Earth. Overnight, its most valuable export became worth 4 times more. Petrodollars flooded into Moscow. And here's the twist that almost nobody talks about. That flood of easy money didn't save the Soviet Union. It quietly killed it. Because that money let the Kremlin avoid every hard decision it needed to make. Think of a household that suddenly wins the lottery. Instead of fixing the leaking roof or paying off debt, they use the windfall to keep living exactly as before, just more comfortably. The underlying problems don't disappear. They get hidden, and they grow. That's what happened to the Soviet system through the 1970s. The oil money papered over a broken economy. It bought imported grain to feed a population its own farms couldn't. It bought Western machinery. It funded a global military, and it delayed reform by an entire decade. Then the lottery ran out. Here's the number that should be on the cover of every history book about this, and almost never is. In the early 1980s, oil sold for around $30 a barrel. By the middle of the decade, it had collapsed to around 10. The Soviet Union's single greatest source of hard currency lost roughly 2/3 of its value in just a few years. The empire didn't lose a war. It lost its income. And this is where the official story starts to fall apart. Because if collapse was simply about communism failing, why did the system survive for 70 years, through famine, through World War, through Stalin, and then suddenly disintegrate in the space of about 6 years? Ideas don't work on that kind of timeline. Cash flow does. We've been taught to see the fall of the Soviet Union as a moral story. Good defeated evil, freedom defeated tyranny. And there's truth in the human side of that. Real people did risk everything for freedom, and that matters. But underneath the moral story is a financial one. A story of debt taken on at the worst possible moment. Of foreign banks that suddenly stopped lending. Of a government that was, by 1991, quite literally begging Western capitals for emergency credit just to buy food. The men who ran the Soviet Union in its final years weren't fighting an ideology. They were fighting insolvency. They were doing what any desperate borrower does when the money runs dry, selling gold reserves, calling old enemies, and praying the next loan came through before the shelves went empty. To understand how the second superpower on the planet went broke, you have to forget the speeches and the summits. You have to forget the myth of an ideological war won and lost. You have to look at the numbers, the bonds, the oil price charts, the gold shipments leaving Moscow in the dead of night. Because the Soviet Union wasn't defeated, it was foreclosed on. And the people who saw it coming, the economists inside the Kremlin, the bankers in London and Frankfurt, the traders watching the oil markets, some of them knew years in advance exactly what was going to happen. They watched the empire borrow itself into a corner. And they said nothing. To understand how it really happened, we need to forget the mythology and look at the money. Let's start with the debts. To understand why the Soviet Union went broke, you first have to understand what it was actually selling to the world. And the answer is uncomfortable for a country that promised to bury capitalism. It was selling raw materials, oil, natural gas, gold, timber. The workers' paradise paid its bills the same way a colonial economy does, by pulling wealth out of the ground and shipping it abroad. By the early 1980s, energy exports made up a staggering share of Soviet hard currency earnings. Some estimates put oil and gas together at more than half of everything the country earned from the outside world. Half. From a single category of goods dug out of Siberian permafrost. Think about what that actually means. A superpower's entire ability to buy from the West, grain, technology, medicine, machine tools, depended on the price of one commodity it did not control. A commodity whose price was set in trading rooms in New York and London, not in Moscow. The Soviet Union had built a house on a foundation of oil, and it never seemed to occur to the men in charge that the ground could move. Here is the part almost nobody explains clearly. The Soviet economy could not feed itself. This is one of the great buried facts of the Cold War. The nation with the largest landmass on the planet, with some of the richest farmland in Ukraine and southern Russia, could not grow enough grain to feed its own people. Year after year, harvests fell short, and year after year, Moscow covered the gap by buying grain from the West, above all from the United States, its supposed mortal enemy. Let that sink in. The Soviet Union was buying wheat from American farmers, paying for it in hard currency it earned by selling oil. So the entire food supply of the socialist world rested quietly on the oil price. When oil was high, there was bread. When oil was low, there was a crisis. That was the real equation running underneath all the speeches about the glorious future. Now let's talk about names, not just numbers. Because the West lent money is too vague. The lending was specific. Through the 1970s and into the 80s, Western banks, German, French, Austrian, British, Japanese, extended enormous credits to the Soviet bloc. Governments encouraged it. This wasn't charity. A West German bank lending to Moscow earned interest, and it also bound the Soviets into contracts, pipelines, factories, equipment deals that fed Western industry. It felt like a win for everyone. The most famous example is the gas for pipes arrangement of the early 80s. West Germany and other European nations agreed to help build the pipelines that would carry Siberian gas westward. In exchange, they would receive that gas for decades. European banks financed it. European companies supplied the steel and the compressor stations. And the Soviet Union got Western technology plus a future stream of hard currency. The Reagan administration was furious about it. Washington saw the pipeline as a lifeline to a regime it wanted to strangle and tried to block it. The Europeans went ahead anyway because the deal was simply too good to refuse. Remember that, the split between America wanting to squeeze the Soviets and Europe wanting to trade with them. It matters enormously later. So by the mid-80s, the picture looks like this. A Soviet economy addicted to oil revenue. A food supply dependent on imported grain. A growing pile of foreign debt owed to Western banks. And a technological base falling further behind the West with every passing year. Every one of those threads runs back to the same knot. Hard currency. The Soviet Union needed dollars and Deutschmarks the way a body needs blood. Not rubles. Rubles were worthless outside the bloc, a currency nobody in the West wanted. It needed real, convertible, Western money. And there were only three ways to get it. Sell oil and gas, sell gold, or borrow. For a while, all three worked at once, and the illusion held. Oil was expensive, the gold reserves were deep, the banks were generous, and so the Kremlin could keep the shelves stocked, the army funded, and the empire fed, without ever fixing the rotten machinery underneath. But look closely at those three sources, and you'll notice something frightening. They were all fragile in the same direction. If the oil price fell, export earnings collapsed. If export earnings collapsed, you had to sell more gold to cover the gap, draining a reserve that could only be spent once. And if you'd already borrowed heavily, the banks would look at your falling income and your shrinking gold and decide you were no longer a safe bet. They would stop lending. Or worse, they'd demand to be repaid. In other words, the three lifelines weren't independent. They were chained together. A shock to one would pull down the others. The Soviet financial system wasn't diversified. It was a row of dominoes standing in a straight line, waiting for a push. And here is the cruelest detail of all. The people making Soviet economic policy did not really know how bad it was. The numbers were a fog of lies. Factories reported output they hadn't produced. Regions inflated their harvests to please Moscow. The true figures on debt, on reserves, on production were scattered, distorted, or simply hidden, sometimes even from the leadership itself. Imagine trying to steer a ship when the fuel gauge is fake, the map is out of date, and the crew is lying about how much water is in the hold. That was Soviet economic management by the middle of the 1980s. The men at the top were flying blind into the most dangerous financial moment in their country's history. There's a broader point here that goes beyond the Soviet Union, and it's worth pausing on. Any system, a company, a household, an empire that comes to depend on a single source of easy money will eventually mistake luck for skill. The oil windfall of the 70s made Soviet planners look competent when they were merely fortunate. It hid every bad decision behind a wall of petrodollars. And when a system is fooled by its own good luck, it stops preparing for bad luck. It takes on debt it can only service if the good times continue forever. It builds commitments, a global military, client states from Cuba to Angola, subsidies to Eastern Europe, on the assumption that the money will never stop. The Soviet Union subsidized its entire empire this way. It sold oil to its Eastern European satellites below world prices, essentially paying them to stay loyal. It armed and funded allies across the developing world. It maintained a military that consumed an enormous share of the economy. Historians and economists still argue over the exact figure, but by any honest estimate it was crushing, far higher as a share of output than anything the West carried. All of this was affordable only in a world of $30 oil and open Western credit lines. Now ask the obvious question. What happens to this entire structure, the grain imports, the debt, the gold sales, the subsidized empire, the giant military, if the oil price falls hard and stays down for years? The answer is that it cannot survive. Not with reform, not without it. The math simply stops working, the blood stops flowing, and a body without blood does not negotiate or reform its way back to health. It begins to die, organ by organ. By 1985, everything was in place for exactly that catastrophe. The dependence on oil was total, the debt was mounting. The gold could only be sold once, the banks were watching, and the true state of the books was hidden behind a wall of falsified numbers. The empire was one price shock away from insolvency. It didn't have to wait long, because in the mid-1980s, the oil price didn't just dip, it fell off a cliff. And the collapse in the market wasn't entirely an accident of supply and demand. Decisions were made, in specific rooms by specific people, that helped drive the price of oil into the ground at the exact moment the Soviet Union could least afford it. Some of those people understood precisely what a low oil price would do to Moscow. And that is where the trigger was pulled. Every collapse has a moment when the trap snaps shut. For the Soviet Union, that moment came from the last place its leaders were looking. Not from a battlefield, not from a summit table, from the price of a barrel of oil, and from a decision made in the sands of Saudi Arabia. Let's set the scene. By the early 1980s, the world was actually swimming in oil. The high prices of the 70s had done what high prices always do. They pushed everyone to drill more and use less. New oil fields came online in the North Sea, in Alaska, in Mexico. Cars got more efficient. Factories switched fuels. Demand softened while supply grew. To stop prices from crashing, the OPEC cartel, led by Saudi Arabia, the largest producer, did something painful. It cut its own production, again and again. Saudi Arabia in particular slashed its output dramatically, acting as what oil traders call the swing producer, the one who cuts back to hold the price up for everyone else. Think about what that meant for the Saudis. They were pumping less and less oil, sacrificing their own sales just to keep the global price high. And who was one of the biggest beneficiaries of that high price, selling every barrel it could while the Saudis held back? The Soviet Union. Moscow was a free rider. It enjoyed the expensive oil the Saudis were bleeding to maintain. And the Saudis knew it. Then, in 1985, Saudi Arabia changed its mind. It got tired of losing money and market share to hold up a price that everyone else was exploiting. So it opened the taps. It stopped cutting. It flooded the market with oil. The effect was violent. The price of oil collapsed, falling by more than half in a matter of months, down toward $10 a barrel from around $30. For consumers in the West, it was a windfall. Cheap gas, cheap heating, an economic boom. For the Soviet Union, it was a financial heart attack. Now here is where the story splits into two versions, and you have to decide which one you believe. The simple version says this was just markets doing what markets do. The Saudis acted in their own economic self-interest, got sick of subsidizing everyone else, and turned the taps back on. The Soviet collapse in oil revenue was pure collateral damage, an accident. The other version says something more deliberate was going on, and there is real evidence for it. Because in the same period, the United States and Saudi Arabia grew remarkably close. The Reagan administration wanted, openly and explicitly, to squeeze the Soviet Union's finances. Reagan and his CIA director, William Casey, understood something that many people missed. They understood that Moscow's power rested on that river of oil money. Cut the river, and you cut the empire's strength at the source. Records and later accounts by insiders, most famously by the writer Peter Schweitzer, who interviewed key Reagan officials, describe a deliberate American strategy to attack the Soviet economy. Part of that strategy, these accounts argue, was to encourage the Saudis to keep oil cheap. A low oil price served American consumers and gutted Soviet revenues at the same time. It was, in this telling, an economic weapon aimed straight at the Kremlin's bank account. Now, historians argue fiercely about how much of the price crash was American design and how much was pure Saudi economics. The honest answer is that it was probably both. The Saudis had their own solid reasons to open the taps, but it is also true that the outcome lined up perfectly with what Washington wanted, and that senior Americans were actively cultivating the Saudis at exactly that time. You don't have to believe in a grand conspiracy to see that a lot of powerful people were pushing in the same direction, and that some of them knew exactly what a cheap barrel would do to Moscow. Here's the key point, whichever version you prefer. The Soviet Union's fate was now being decided by decisions made outside its borders, by people who owed it nothing. Its single most important source of hard currency was hostage to a cartel meeting in Vienna and a royal family in Riyadh. The empire that claimed to control the destiny of nations couldn't control the one number that kept it alive. And the timing was catastrophic, because at that very moment, 1985, a new man had just taken power in the Kremlin. His name was Mikhail Gorbachev. Gorbachev came in wanting to reform and revitalize the system. He had plans. He wanted to modernize industry, to shake the economy out of its stupor, to invest in new technology. All of that required money. And he took power in the exact year the money disappeared. Imagine inheriting a struggling family business, walking in the door with a bold plan to turn it around, and discovering on your first day that your largest customer has just cancelled every order. That was Gorbachev's inheritance. The reforms he dreamed of needed a war chest. Instead, he got a collapsing revenue stream and a mountain of commitments he couldn't cut. And so he did the only thing he could. He borrowed. This is one of the most important and least understood parts of the whole story. Under Gorbachev, in the second half of the 1980s, Soviet foreign debt didn't shrink. It ballooned. To keep the shelves stocked and the reforms alive without the oil money, the Soviet Union went on a borrowing spree with Western banks and governments. The debt roughly doubled, then kept climbing, reaching tens of billions of dollars in hard currency owed to foreigners. Every loan was a future obligation. Every loan assumed that someday the money would come back. But the money wasn't coming back because the oil price stayed low for years. So Moscow was borrowing not to invest, but simply to survive, to buy this year's grain, to cover this year's gap. That is the financial definition of a death spiral. When you borrow to pay for consumption, not investment, you are not solving a crisis. You are mortgaging the future to delay it. And there was one more hidden player in this drama: gold. As the hard currency ran dry, the Soviet Union began quietly selling off its gold reserves. These reserves were a state secret, one of the most closely guarded numbers in the entire country. For decades, Western analysts had assumed the Soviet gold hoard was vast, a deep, almost bottomless reserve. It wasn't. As the 80s ended, insiders began to realize the gold was going out the door at an alarming rate, sold on world markets for the dollars the empire so desperately needed. The bottomless reserve had a bottom, and it was coming up fast. Picture it. In the final years, gold was being shipped out of Moscow and sold abroad to raise cash, the financial equivalent of a family selling the heirlooms to pay the electricity bill. When a great power starts liquidating its gold to buy food, the end is no longer a question of if, it's a question of when. By 1989 and 1990, the numbers were becoming impossible to hide. The oil revenue was gone, the debt was enormous and growing, the gold was draining away, and the banks, the Western banks that had lent so freely in the good years, were starting to get nervous. Because bankers, whatever else you think of them, can read a balance sheet. And the balance sheet of the Soviet Union in 1990 told a terrifying story. Falling income, rising debt, vanishing reserves. To a lender, that is the profile of a borrower about to default. The trap was now fully closed, and the people who would pay for it were not the leaders in the Kremlin, or the traders in the West, or the royals in Riyadh. It was the ordinary people, the ones standing in line, in the cold, waiting for bread that was about to run out. Numbers on a balance sheet are abstract, empty shelves are not. And by the end of the 1980s, the financial collapse we've been tracing stopped being a story about oil prices and foreign debt. It walked into every Soviet kitchen. It stood in every line. It became the daily grinding humiliation of a great power that could no longer feed its own citizens. Let's start with the lines. The queues. If you lived in the Soviet Union in 1990, waiting in line became a second job. People queued for hours for bread, for milk, for meat, for soap, for cigarettes. Not because the money was worthless, people had rubles in their pockets, but because there was nothing to buy. The shelves were bare. The rubles bought nothing. This is one of the strangest and cruelest features of the collapse. It wasn't classic hyperinflation, not yet. It was scarcity. The government kept prices officially low, but the goods simply weren't there. So instead of paying with money, people paid with time, with their lives hour by hour, standing in the cold. Think about what that does to a person. You finish a full day of work, and then you stand for 2 hours hoping the shop still has bread when you reach the front. Some days it doesn't. You go home with nothing, and you know that tomorrow you'll do it all again. That is what national bankruptcy feels like from the ground. Not a chart, a queue that ends in an empty counter. Behind the empty shelves was the machinery we've already traced. The hard currency was gone, so the grain imports were harder to sustain. The domestic economy, starved of investment and wrecked by decades of central planning, couldn't fill the gap. And the state, drowning in debt and selling its gold, had less and less ability to paper over the shortages. Now add inflation to the scarcity, because that came too. As the crisis deepened, the government did what desperate governments always do. It printed money. When you cannot balance the books, when you cannot cut spending and cannot raise real revenue, the printing press becomes the last resort. More rubles chased fewer goods. And so, on top of the empty shelves, the money in people's pockets began to lose its value. By the early 1990s, as controls broke down, prices exploded. Savings that people had built over a lifetime, the careful rubles set aside for old age, for a child's future, for a rainy day, evaporated. A lifetime of thrift wiped out in months. Millions of ordinary, cautious, hard-working people watched their security dissolve through no fault of their own. Picture an elderly couple who had saved for 40 years, who had done everything right by the rules of their society, worked hard, saved, trusted the state. And then, at the end of their lives, they discovered their savings would no longer buy a week's groceries. That betrayal, quiet, bureaucratic, invisible on any battlefield, was repeated across an entire nation. And here is the part that should make you angry. While ordinary people stood in lines and watched their savings die, the system was not collapsing equally for everyone. Those with access, with connections, with position, with a way to touch the flows of hard currency and scarce goods, were often doing just fine. In an economy of shortage, the person who controls access to goods becomes king. The store manager who keeps meat under the counter, the official who can approve an import, the insider who can turn state property into private wealth as the old rules dissolved. As the Soviet state broke apart, some of the best connected people in the country were not ruined. They were positioned. They understood, earlier than the public, that the old system was finished. and they moved to grab what they could of its assets before the doors closed. The factories, the resources, the export licenses, the seeds of the brutal inequality that followed in the 1990s were planted in these final Soviet years, when insiders with foresight quietly converted a dying state's wealth into their own. This is the recurring pattern of every financial collapse, in every country, in every era. The costs fall on the people with the least, the ones who trusted the system, who had no inside information, who couldn't move their money or their lives. And the people closest to power, the ones who often helped create the crisis, or at least saw it coming, find a way to land on their feet, or even come out ahead. The ordinary Soviet citizen did not cause the oil price to crash, did not sign the foreign loans, did not sell the gold, did not falsify the production numbers. They simply lived their lives, did their work, and trusted that the state knew what it was doing. And they paid the highest price of all for decisions made far above them, in rooms they would never enter, by people they would never meet. There were human costs deeper than empty shelves and worthless savings. As the economy cracked, so did the fabric of daily life. Public health deteriorated. Life expectancy, especially for men, began a grim slide that would accelerate into the 1990s. Despair spread. Alcohol consumption, always a shadow over Soviet life, deepened. The stress of watching a familiar world disintegrate, of not knowing whether there would be food next week, of savings turning to dust, took a toll that no economic statistic fully captures. An entire society was living through the slow-motion failure of everything it had been promised. The state had asked for enormous sacrifices across the decades, always with the promise that it was building towards something secure, something permanent, something that would take care of you. And now that promise was dissolving on the shelves of empty shops. It's worth sitting with the scale of this. This was not a small country. This was a superpower of nearly 300 million people, spread across 11 time zones. When its finances failed, the suffering wasn't confined to one city or one region. It touched a factory worker in the Urals, and a teacher in Ukraine, and a pensioner in Moscow, and a young family in the Caucasus. Hundreds of millions of individual lives, each one thrown into uncertainty by the same underlying failure of money. And the tragedy is that most of them never understood what had really happened. They were told, then and later, that communism had failed, that the system was rotten, that history had simply turned a page, all of which contained some truth. But almost none of them were told the specific financial story. The oil dependence, the grain imports, the doubling debt, the secret gold sales, the price crash engineered or exploited by outsiders, the specific traceable chain of money that turned their lives upside down. They felt the consequences with total clarity, but the causes were kept abstract, distant, ideological. Easier to say the system failed than to trace the barrels and the bonds and name the decisions. Which brings us to a harder question. If the real story is this clear, if you can follow the money this precisely, then why is it still not the story we tell? Why do the textbooks still lead with ideology and end with Reagan's speeches? Why, decades later, do most people still believe the simple myth instead of the financial truth? The answer is not an accident, because it turns out that a lot of powerful people, on both sides of the old Cold War, had very good reasons to prefer the myth. So we have a clear, traceable, financial story. Oil dependence, grain imports, a price crash in 1985, doubling debt, secret gold sales, a superpower foreclosed on. If it's this clear, why isn't it the story in the textbooks? Why do most people still reach first for communism failed and Reagan won? The answer isn't a single grand conspiracy. It's something quieter and more powerful. It's that almost everyone with the ability to shape the story had a reason to prefer a different version. Follow the money one more time. This time, the money and the motive behind the myth itself. Start with the American side. The collapse of the Soviet Union was the greatest geopolitical victory in modern American history. Now ask a simple question. Which version of that victory is more flattering? Version 1. America, through the strength of its ideals and the resolve of its leaders, stared down an evil empire and won. Freedom triumphed. A president stood at a wall and demanded it be torn down, and history obeyed. Version 2. The Soviet Union was a petrostate that got lucky with high oil prices in the 1970s, wasted the windfall, and then went bankrupt when the price crashed. A crash that was partly ordinary market forces and partly Saudi self-interest. The first version is a triumph of American character. The second is a story where oil markets and a Saudi production decision did much of the heavy lifting. Of course, the first version won. It's better television. It flatters the winners. It gives clear heroes. And it served every American politician who wanted to claim the mantle of the leader who won the Cold War. There's a whole industry built on version 1. Memoirs, documentaries, political careers, an entire narrative of national greatness. Nobody with a stake in that narrative benefits from telling you it was substantially about the price of a barrel of oil. Now flip to the other side. Look at the people who ran the Soviet Union and then ran the states that emerged from it. For them, the financial story is also deeply inconvenient, but for the opposite reason. If the collapse was about specific, avoidable financial decisions, then specific people were responsible. The leaders who bet the entire economy on oil, who failed to reform when the money was flowing, who doubled the debt in a doomed attempt to buy time, who sold the gold in secret. The financial story names names and assigns blame. How much more comfortable to say it was all inevitable. That vast, impersonal historical forces brought the system down. That nobody could have done anything differently. The system was doomed from the start is a wonderful line if you were one of the people running that system into the ground. It turns personal failure into historical destiny. It converts culprits into bystanders. So on the losing side too, the myth is convenient. It absolves the leadership. It spares them the specific, uncomfortable accounting of who decided what and when and why. And there's a third group with a stake in the myth. The Western banks and governments that lent so freely to Moscow in the 1970s and 80s. Remember, these institutions poured credit into a bloc that turned out to be a terrible risk. In the tidy ideological story, that lending barely comes up. But in the financial story, it's central, and it raises awkward questions. Why did sophisticated Western banks keep lending to a bankrupt system? Did they understand the risk? Were the loans about profit, or about politics, or about binding the Soviets into dependence? The financial story shines a light on Western financiers who would rather not be part of the story at all. The ideological story lets them stay off camera. Now put those three groups together. American politicians who wanted a heroic victory, former Soviet leaders who wanted absolution, Western financiers who wanted to stay invisible. Three powerful groups, former enemies even, all with a reason to prefer the simple ideological tale over the specific financial one. When that many powerful interests quietly align on the same convenient story, that story becomes the official history. Not through censorship, through incentive. Everyone who could correct the record had a reason not to. Then there's a subtler reason the myth survives, and it has nothing to do with self-interest. It's just easier to understand. Communism failed is a sentence a child can grasp. Good beat evil fits on a poster. The financial story asks more of you. It asks you to understand what a petrostate is, why a currency has to be convertible, how oil prices are set, what sovereign debt is and why borrowing to fund consumption is fatal, why gold reserves matter. It asks you to hold 6 or 7 moving parts in your head at once and see how they interact. Human beings reach for simple stories. Historians, textbook writers, documentary makers, they know their audience wants a clear arc with heroes and villains, not a lecture on commodity markets. So the simple story spreads and the complex one stays in specialist books that most people never read. This isn't a lie so much as a laziness, the natural drift of any story toward the version that's easiest to tell and easiest to sell. To be fair, serious economic historians have studied all of this. There are scholars who have documented the oil dependence, the debt, the gold sales in detail. The financial story is not secret. It's sitting in the academic literature. The point is not that no one knows it. The point is that it never made the jump from the scholarly journals into the popular imagination, because the myth got there first, backed by all those powerful interests and carried by its own simplicity. And here's the deeper lesson, the one that goes beyond this single collapse. Be suspicious of any historical story where the moral is flattering and the mechanism is vague. When you're told that your side won because it was good, and the details of how are left fuzzy, that's exactly when you should follow the money. The comforting story and the true story are rarely the same story, and the gap between them is almost always filled with someone's self-interest. The Soviet collapse is a near-perfect case study. The comforting story, ideology, heroism, moral triumph, is emotionally satisfying and politically useful, and crucially, hard to fact-check with a single number. The true story, oil, debt, gold, a price crash, specific decisions by specific people, is harder to tell, less flattering to everyone involved, and far more useful if you actually want to understand how great powers really rise and fall. Which brings us to why any of this matters now, in your life, today.
Did you
Because the
see
mechanism
that?
that destroyed the Soviet Union
I
isn't
can't
locked in the
believe
past.
it!
It isn't unique to
Whoa!
communism. It's a pattern. And that same pattern is playing out right now in places you might not expect. If you learn to see it, the dependence on a single revenue source, the windfall wasted, the debt taken on to delay the reckoning, the powerful few who see it coming and position themselves while everyone else stands in line, then you can spot the next collapse before it arrives. Let me show you where that pattern is hiding today. So here we are, in the present. And the uncomfortable truth is that the pattern which destroyed the Soviet Union is not a museum piece, it's a blueprint. And versions of it are being built right now, in plain sight, by people who apparently never read the history. Let's name the pattern clearly, because once you see it, you can't unsee it. It has 4 stages. Stage 1, a windfall. A country, a company, or a government stumbles into a river of easy money. For the Soviets, it was the oil shock of the 1970s. It could be any single dominant source of income that suddenly gushes. Stage 2, the windfall is wasted. Instead of using the good times to fix deep problems, the money is spent papering over them. Hard decisions get postponed. The easy money makes bad management look like genius. Stage 3, debt fills the gap. When the windfall fades, instead of facing reality, the borrowing begins. Debt is taken on not to build the future, but to preserve the present, to keep the lights on and the shelves stocked one more year. Stage 4, the reckoning. The revenue source falters, the debt comes due, and the whole structure collapses, while the well-connected few who saw it coming get out first, and the ordinary people who trusted the system pay the bill. Windfall, waste, debt, reckoning. That's the cycle. Now look at the world around you. Look at the modern petrostates. Countries today that depend on oil or gas for the overwhelming majority of their revenue are running the exact Soviet playbook. When the price is high, they look invincible. Grand cities rise from the desert, budgets balloon, populations grow comfortable and dependent on state subsidies. But their entire model rests on one number they don't
Figures from the
control.
72 harvest
Let the
report
price
still
of
seem
oil
inflated,
fall and
comrade. The
stay
regional
low for a
quotas
few
were
years,
officially met
and you
according
will
to this
watch the
directive. The
Soviet
grain
story
shipments confirm
rerun
it.
in real time. The pressure, the borrowing, the desperate search for hard currency. Some of these states know it, which is why the smartest of them are scrambling to diversify before their windfall runs out. They've read the history. The question is whether they've read it in time. But you don't even have to look at petrostates. Look closer to home. Look at governments across the developed world that have grown dependent not on oil, but on permanently cheap borrowing. For years, interest rates sat near zero. Money was almost free. And what did many governments do with that windfall of cheap credit? Exactly what the Soviets did with cheap oil. They used it to avoid hard choices. They borrowed to fund today's spending, assuming the easy money would last forever. National debts climbed to levels that would once have been unthinkable, all resting on the assumption that borrowing would stay cheap. Then, in recent years, the price of that money changed. Inflation returned, interest rates rose, and suddenly the cost of servicing all that debt began to climb. Governments that had built their budgets on permanently cheap credit found themselves in the early stages of a very familiar squeeze. The windfall of free money is over. The debt remains. The reckoning is arriving in slow motion. Do you see the symmetry? The Soviet Union bet its future on cheap oil staying expensive. Much of the modern world bet its future on expensive money staying cheap. Different commodity, identical mistake. A dependence on one favorable number, mistaken for permanent, built into the foundations of the whole system. And the human cost rhymes too. When these reckonings come, who pays? Not usually the people who made the decisions. It's the saver whose money loses value to inflation. The young person locked out of a future the borrowing was supposed to secure. The ordinary citizen who trusted that the people in charge knew what they were doing. The same players, in the same roles, in every era. The insiders position themselves. The public stands in line. This is why the real story of the Soviet collapse matters far beyond history class. Because if you believe the myth that it was just communism failing, a one-time event with no lessons for us, then you'll never see the same pattern coming for systems you assumed were safe. The myth is comforting precisely because it tells you, that was them. This is us. It can't happen here. But money doesn't care about ideology. The laws of debt and dependence apply to democracies and dictatorships, to capitalists and communists alike. A balance sheet is a balance sheet. Follow the money, and the same warnings light up across centuries and across systems. The people who understand this, who can look past the flattering headlines and the ideological stories and read the actual flows of money, are the ones who see the world as it really is. They spot the windfall being wasted. They notice the debt being taken on to delay the inevitable. They watch what the insiders do, not what the leaders say. And they are rarely the ones standing in line when the shelves go empty. That's what this channel is about. Cutting through the comforting stories to follow the money to where it actually leads. Because in a world drowning in noise and spin and flattering myths, the ability to trace the real financial mechanisms underneath the headlines isn't just interesting, it's a form of protection. So let me leave you with 3 things. First, a question. And I want a real answer in the comments, not a vague one. Mikhail Gorbachev inherited the collapsing oil revenue in 1985 and responded by doubling the debt to keep the system alive. So tell me, do you think Gorbachev knew he was mortgaging the future and did it anyway to buy time? Or was he a prisoner of a system that gave him no real choice? Type yes if you think he knew exactly what he was doing. Type no if you think he was trapped by forces beyond his control. I read the replies, and I want to see where you land. Second, send this to one person who still believes the Soviet Union simply collapsed because communism doesn't work. That's not wrong exactly, but it's a tiny fraction of the truth. Send them this video. It might change not just how they see the past, but how they see the debt and the dependence building up all around us right now. And third, here's where we're going next. Because there's a document I want to show you. In the final years of the Soviet Union, as the gold reserves drained away and the debt exploded, there were people inside the system who knew, who had the real numbers, who understood that the empire was insolvent,
I'll tell the
and who
London
kept
team
it
to prep the
hidden while
documents.
reassuring the public that everything was under control. Next week, I'll walk you through what the insiders knew, and when they knew it, about how empty the vault had really become. Because the story of who saw the end coming and stayed silent is even darker than the collapse itself. Follow the money. Don't get fooled by the myth, and I'll see you in the next one.